Revolution Podcast. For most of you, happy Monday. I hope this is a great way to start your week. Changing the music up a little bit for Monday. I feel like this is a good start your week off jam. For those of you new to the show, new listeners, this was me trying to play Slayer, trying to play country music, and that's as close as I'm going to get to playing country music as this opening theme. Anyway, this show was a show Pascal had been, I wouldn't say harping on about, but he had been talking about for a while. And the guest name is Chelsea Stieber, as she said. Stieber, like Bieber. We were off here. And it talks about Haiti post the revolution. And a lot of the conversation around Haiti, especially from a left perspective, it tends to stop in 1804, right? It's the story of Haiti is kind of told almost as if Haitian people are a bit of a monolith, and Pascal, who is a Haitian American and has studied Haiti for the majority of his life, and his father and uncles were, big influences on him and taught him a lot about the class conflicts that happen within Haiti. So Pascal was to say he was excited about this is an understatement, because this book really gets into the weeds. I want to say I think it's from like it's basically the 19th century Haiti to the 1950s, right? And in the bonus patron after hours, we definitely get into a conversation about the Duvaliers and are they Afro-fascist? And it's funny because Pascal was like, I don't want to get into this. I don't want to get it. And then he just dives in the deep end of the pool on the idea of the latter, Baby Doc being a bit of a fascist. He gets into it. They talk about it. They discuss it. And there was some things they didn't agree on, but it was a very good discussion. And as I told Pascal, because he was just you can't see it because this is audio. He's just grinning the whole time through. He's so excited to do this show. It was a lot of fun, actually, to be a part of. I'm glad we did this. But if you want to see these shows live, we do live streams every Tuesday through Thursday and Saturday morning. Tuesday through Thursday, 6 p.m. Pacific time. The best places to watch it are YouTube, youtube.com/This is Revolution Podcast. And if you have the means and you feel so inclined and you would love to help the show grow, and you want to get some bonus content, which is these after-hour segments, and I will say our after-hour segment with the Sam Cedar show was a good one. It felt good to do. So that is patreon.com/Bitter Lake Presents. Wherever you are listening to this, there are links in the description to Patreon, to YouTube, to Twitch, to all of our social media. So be prepared for a very deep dive into Haitian history post the Haitian Revolution. Talk about these two warring factions, the Republic faction and the Dessalinists. Was Haiti to be another empire? Also, there's links in the description wherever you're listening to this show to the book, The Paper Wars of Haiti by Chelsea Stieber. So get ready. This is almost like another Mau Mau hour. Pascal just went off on this. That music means I'm just talking too long. So thank you guys for listening. Wherever you're listening to this show, please share it with your people. And I am out. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another episode of This is Revolution Podcast. I am your host, Jason Miles. If you haven't done it already, if you are new to the show, please hit the like and subscribe button. It does help us out in the algorithm. And before we bring in our guest, let me bring in my co-host, my homie, my dog. He is the man of the Mau Mau Hour. He is probably the dopest Haitian in all of Miami right now. He is the Pascal Robert.
Peace and greetings to the chat. Peace and greetings to the audience. Peace and greetings, Jason Miles.
Someone says there's a lot of testosterone in that intro, which I find very interesting because that was co-written, and you can kind of hear the vocals with my ex, who is a woman. She played guitar on that with me, so I don't know what to tell you. I can fold a burrito, and I did do a lot of cooking in the Gulf of Mexico. So, Pascal, you want to talk about what's going on today in Haitian history?
Today, for those who do not know, is the 218th anniversary of the Battle of Vertières, when Creole is at the Battle of Vertières, which was the last battle in the 13-year process of the Haitian Revolution. And in this battle, which was led by General Jean-Jacques Dessalines, who became the father of Haitian liberty, the Haitian army, under the leadership of a man named General Capois la Mort, Capois the Death, because they call him Capois the Death because he would not die in that battle, defeated the Napoleon army under General Rochambeau, who was a savage, anti-black racist, and sent the French packing. And basically, in 2 or 3 months later, January 1st, 1804, they declared Haiti an independent nation. So that was November 18th, 1803. And this is a date that is renowned in Haitian history and should renowned in Black history or American history overall.
And I also forgot to mention that the other day was Mexican Independence Day, or as they call it here, Revolucion Day.
So, you know, there's actually a You know that Haiti had a role in the Mexican Revolution. I think I talked to you about that.
No, they actually were given, because I didn't know why stuff was closed. And they were like, oh, it's Revolution Day. And then they were explaining to me the whole deal. And I was like, oh, I should mention this on the show. I totally forgot to mention it on the show because I'm a bad gentrifier. There, before you guys can try to call me out. But before we bring in our guest, and I'm very excited for the show. You know why I'm excited for the show? Because Pascal, I believe, booked this show.
Yes.
And when Pascal books a show, it's like, move out of the way, because this dude is very excited to go off and ask a bunch of questions. Our guest, who we were talking to in the virtual green room, seems pretty excited to be interrogated by Pascal. So I'm going to play the intro video for those of you that did not see it. And then we're going to bring in our guest.
Here's Port-au-Prince, Haiti in 1915, cheap city of an island nation torn by internal troubles. Behind these scenes of peace and semi-tropic tranquility, there's uneasiness and unrest. Hill bandits have been raising havoc in this marketplace for months, and there's been too much bickering within government itself to stop the raids. Having suffered a succession of weak presidents and almost continuous civil wars, Haiti is now on brink of bankruptcy, and laws of the land have been virtually lost in chaos of island-wide anarchy. And then in 1915, United States Marines land in Haiti to battle Haitian bandits, threatening destruction of American properties, and native bandits.
The Haitian Revolution was one of the most important forces in changing the trajectory of the West in the 19th century. The former slaves defeated three of the mightiest European powers to achieve their freedom and liberation. The question that rarely is asked is, what was the philosophical foundation of their governing structure after independence? Was Haiti trying to be an example of, quote, Atlantic Humanism in the form of Western Enlightenment Societies? Or was Haiti setting a different path in order to illustrate a rejection of the Western values to highlight their sheer racial hypocrisy? Also, was there a true consensus in Haiti after independence on these issues? We'll ask these questions and more. This is Revolution.
Get beyond this.
To be left alone. In short, because when it was ostracized after 1804 for several decades, the Haitian peasants had the highest standard of living in this hemisphere outside the U.S. Highest standard of living. They were fat and sassy, but there was no interaction with the outside world. It needs to be left alone. I remember what John Paul II said when he went on some of his trips to West Africa. He said, when Africa is left alone, she works. It works. But of course, it didn't leave Africa alone. He insisted.
And you wanted to say something about that gentleman that was at the end of the clip, right, Pascal?
No, the only problem I have with this presentation is the notion that after the revolution, the peasants were fat and sassy. I said, if you know anything about the way in which the peasants in Haiti were treated under the corvée system and rendered basically as semi-slaves, particularly under the administration of Boyer in the South, with the slave codes or the actual code rural or the rural codes, you wouldn't be calling Haitians fat and sassy after 1804. But that's Haitian peasants, I should say.
Well, he comes from upper class of Haitian, I don't want to say royalty, but
Elite.
That's the word I'm looking for. Thank you.
I'm familiar. No, I mean, I understand what he was trying to say. He was making an analysis to say that they were being treated better than black slaves in the Western Hemisphere, which is, I understand his point. I'm not trying to fault him at all.
You just don't like the guy.
No, I don't know him personally.
Pascal doesn't like light-skinned black people.
That's not true. Torre is a good friend of mine. Cedric is a good friend.
See, I have
Don't make me do that. But some of my best friends are light skinned black people.
My best friends are light skinned. Before we bring in our guests, I want to the opening passage of her book. This book begins where so many others conclude. 1804. On January 1st, 1804, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, general of the Armée, proclaimed the independent state of Haiti, marking the triumph of 13 years of revolutionary fighting and over 3 centuries of colonial rule. This year, 1804, also marked the end of the redemptive possibilities of a utopian revolution and the beginning of the fraught project of post-colonial anti-slavery statehood. Recent scholarship has begun to explore the challenges that the Atlantic world powers pose to Haitian sovereignty and legitimacy during the age of revolution, but there existed an equally important internal challenge to Haiti's post-independence sovereignty: a civil war between those who envision an anti-colonial, anti-slavery empire and those who wish to establish a liberal republic. Please welcome Professor Chelsea Stieber.
Hello.
Hello. Thank you for coming on, Dr. Stieber. I just want to tell you to announce to our audience that I've completed your book. I have a physical copy here, Haiti's Paper Wars. And I just want to say, and unabashedly, I think this is one of the most important and one of the best books on Haitian history that has come out at least in the last decade, maybe longer. And I really want to appreciate you for the work that you've done. But the first question I want to ask actually is that how did you become interested and familiar with Haitian history and Haitian historiography and Haitian politics, particularly in the post-revolutionary era?
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction and for those really extremely kind words about my book. It means a lot. So I appreciate it. And you know, being here on November 18th is really meaningful too. So I doubly appreciate that. So I actually came to Haiti via my study of France, which can be a giant red flag and maybe should be. But in my defense, I came to it quite early in that, study of France. And so I was able to kind of reshape my course of inquiry and ultimately, what I work on now and my teaching. So in the sense, I kind of want to frame, what Haiti did for me, which is that it sort of answered all of these questions I had about the myths and grand narratives that France tells about itself, to itself and to the rest of the world. I'd actually originally planned to work on 19th century social movements in France and the realist novel. But I kept, as I embarked on my graduate study, and actually this was from undergraduate as well, I kept kind of running up against these bad vibes I was getting, these inconsistencies I was seeing that really were troubling me increasingly. One of the first was actually this moment of post-World War II historiography in France, of thinking about why and how fascism didn't take hold in France. This was this big argument among French historians, and they argued that there was an immunity thesis, that France was actually immune to fascism because the Republican values were so deeply rooted in the country that fascism couldn't have taken hold. And that didn't obviously jive with what I knew, but I thought it was bonkers, and sort of that troubled me. This, happening in the 1950s at a time when Aimé Césaire is writing Discourse on Colonialism and saying, well, fascism didn't have to take hold because fascism was already there in one way or another, and it's in the colonial project and so on. And so sort of, France's abolition of slavery and then reestablishment of slavery and then second abolition of slavery, all of these narratives of French universalism that again, just really gave me pause and started to trouble me. And then again, as I was embarking on this study, I had the really good fortune of taking classes on Haiti and Haitian history with the late Michael Dash, and then some courses on the Caribbean with the late Kamau Brathwaite. And then sort of through this work and through thinking about Haiti, I realized that, the mask was slipping, and that these myths about France started to become really obvious because Haiti troubled all of it from the very beginning. I'm thinking of this quote from Exterminate All the Brutes, this Raoul Peck film, where he's sort of riffing on Michel Wolfe-Trouillot, but he says, what happens in Haiti contradicts most of what the West had claimed about itself. And that was certainly true. And I guess just a final point, kind of, again, how did I come to Haiti, Haitian thought, Haitian history? It's something I insist on in the conclusion to my book. So Pascal, because you've read the whole way through. I recognize what Haiti is for me to be a use, even maybe an instrumentalization, which is to say that Haiti has served me and serves me in the face of these kind of imposing, universalizing discourses of, republicanism and these universal values. And it's been, I make a very concerted effort to offset what I see as a sort of instrumentalization, or at the very least, to make it one that I don't think is extractive. But I want to be clear in acknowledging that this is a use of sorts, and I want other scholars to kind of be clear on that as well.
I understand. Well, I would hope that more Haitians get more use of their history and its ability to confront the lies of liberal enlightenment as well as Western civilization overall. And I appreciate you explaining that process. And for our Haitian observers, I know I told you I wouldn't do this, but we, Mademoiselle Stieber, elle parle français très bien, so elle parle français. Elle parle créole un petit peu aussi. So just to put that out there, because we might have some Haitian viewers that want to come on.
You said before the show that you guys weren't going to have French.
Yeah, talking. I know, but I realized I might have to do that.
French talking.
Yeah, I know. I told you I wouldn't do it, but that's as far as it's going to go. So let us get to the questions, Professor Stieber. Can you explain what the ideological conflict that drives post-revolutionary Haitian thought is rooted in? Is it an issue of class, color, political ideology, or all of the above?
Jumping right in. And it's an important question. It's a crucial question. I want to start, maybe not with a caveat, but really making clear, again, which I do in my book, but that when I'm talking about thought and the Haitian thought that I'm looking at, it's limited to Haitian writing. So I'm doing this deep sort of, I would argue, nearly exhaustive meditation on writing from the post-independence period, but there is so much Haitian thought that exists outside of what I'm able to capture in the written archive. I'm thinking about some of what Jean Casimir works on throughout his work on le coup structure, familial relationships, conduite, religious traditions, secret societies, customary law. And again, I'm limiting myself to what intellectuals and what politicians, military leaders committed to print and put out into the public sphere in this early post-independence period.
It's very important that you notice that. This is a discourse about the Haitian ruling class, pretty much.
Yeah. I'm clear about that. I'm clear about what I don't do, but I'm clear about, why I think it's important and why I spend so much time teasing.
It's a very good call. I'm glad you're a good scholar that you make that announcement, that this is not a book about the intellectual thoughts on the Haitian proletariat masses or the peasant class. This is about the intellectual historiography of the Haitian ruling class from 1804 up until 1954.
Correct. Yep. And thank you for echoing that. Yeah. So what I tried to do, again, this limited focus that I have, is to look at what I tease out as two distinct approaches in this writing on state formation, and basically what is the arguments for what kind of state and what kind of political project is best for maintaining the anti-slavery, anti-colonial independence of Haiti in an extremely hostile Atlantic world. And so, to go back to your question, I certainly would not limit it to one of these factors: class, color, political ideology. In fact, I would say that to do so is folly, as some previous historians have done. However, certainly each of them play a role. And so sort of to tease that out in, these two approaches that I look at. In my book, I identify what I call one approach, which is the Dessalinian approach, which was quite bellicose in its language and performance of its power, and resolute to its commitment to independence at all costs, and which did not feel compelled to embrace the language and the ideologies of the Age of Revolution. What they charted, the Dessalinian sort of faction, was something unto itself.
I want to extrapolate that, because you talk about this in your book. The Dessalinian project, Dessalines, the leader of the revolution and the victory, declares independence in 1804 and becomes leader of the nation state. And in the actual Haitian Declaration of Independence, he literally vocalizes that this is not a passive project, that this is a project. He literally states that he is rendering himself to the hatred of all the world for his decision to make this an independent country. So he literally, in the Declaration of Independence, says death to France in the Declaration. So to corroborate what you're saying is that the birth of the country is born, not, I wouldn't say to all of Western civilization, but particularly an affront to French ideas of liberalism and enlightened humanity from the beginning.
I think, and when I talk about bellicosity with language, I really mean that there's this performance of the ferocity that was used or would continue to be used to delegitimize Haiti among these powers, and sort of using that and making that sort of the case for Haiti's continued independence. It was not just a refusal. I expounded upon this quite at length in the introduction. It's a critique of it's a making of space of other ways of living, of constructing a state. And actually, the Declaration of Independence is absolutely crucial for that, but also the 1805 Imperial Constitution, which stipulated that Haitians would be known, all Haitians, under this generic name of Noir, of blacks. Yes. And this is in an Atlantic world context in which aspirations to civilization and progress were marked either in this colorless term of citizen, but also in a sort of unspoken white normativity. And so that's sort of this one approach that I tease out again, that I expound upon at length in the book. But the other one then I appreciate you jumping in and giving some of that context. I'll try and remember to give sort of some of the more broad strokes context to this. The other sort of group written archive, I'll call it, was this Republican faction, which is a continuation of the French Revolutionary Project, but in Haiti, perfected or argued to be perfected and brought to its most radical conclusion: colorblind equality, liberty, progress, civilization. And this is important, and this is the Dessalinian sort of refusal and critique and rejection of France, and this absolute bellicose sort of refusal. Is important to think about in the context, because the French Revolution, obviously, and the First Republic had failed. You could either say by 1799, but also definitively by 1804. With the reestablishment of slavery in the colonies in 1802, it's already a betrayal of the Republican values. The attempt to retake Saint-Domingue, the arrest and deportation of Toussaint Louverture, and then the empire of Napoleon I, the Bourbon Restoration. Haiti then, this faction that I look at then really sees itself and casts itself as the continuation or the place where sort of these ideals went when they had failed.
Let me interject. I'm going to be very blunt. First of all, the Southern Project was created by men who were traitors to the Haitian Revolution until Rochambeau became general and they realized they would be exterminated. That was Pétion, that was Boyer, that was Gieffard, that was Rigaud. These were men who were, the term we use in Haitian Creole, mulattoes. And they did not like the fact that the black man Toussaint Louverture, with his aides Jean-Jacques Dessalines and Henri Christophe, were taking charge of the revolution. And because let's not forget that a large percentage of these men before the revolution owned black slaves. Their fathers were French. Many of them had studied in France.
I don't make such a division. And in the book,
I know you don't.
Yeah. Okay. I want to.
You don't. This is not something that's in your book. This is my voice giving more context.
Got
because
it.
this is the division that people don't want to talk about. And I want to talk about it. And what I'm saying is that we cannot contextualize why these men wanted to have an attachment to France without realizing that many of them, before the revolution, had studied in France. Many of them owned slaves. And many of them wanted to maintain their relationship with the French Republic.
Without a doubt, there are a large group of Southern Republicans who fit that bill. But what and the people that I focus on actually in my book are a really important group and not an insignificant group of men who might fit that profile, right? Educated in France, had not been enslaved, who absolutely take up the Dessalinian project.
That's very true, and I'm very glad. And you did a very good job. And this, why I appreciate your book, is that you actually demonstrate the bankruptcy of the notion that Dessalines had some kind of color aversion to the mulattoes or the fair skin, because the men who he trusted the most with his most sacred writing and the planning of his administration were often mulattoes who had the same class comportment of those Southern generals, like Tonnerre, and who literally wrote the Declaration of Independence. Chalet, I think you talk about as well. These men had the same class color advantages of these men of the South, but they fought tooth and nail to defend the Dessalinian project.
Tonnerre and Etienne Montauk were two of those men who were actually assassinated, killed in their prison cell after the assassination of Dessalines. But so yeah, I mean, again, I think this is where I'm seeing some of our interesting differences of opinion or difference of approach. What I try and do, and again, to read the whole book is it's long, and I really try and embrace the complexity. And for me, it has been dissatisfying to cut only along either regional or color, or I mean, political ideology. It's hard to cut across. It's changing and it's evolving, and it's cutting across these different sort of divisions. But so I think one thing that I would I guess want to really highlight here is that I think what's most fascinating is the choice made by, and it's interesting you're saying, some of the men he most trusted with his writings. That's absolutely true. But he also, dictated and was a huge participant, Dessalines, in the articulation of his project. And so thinking about him sort of as an author of this as well is really, I think, important.
Right. And I think one of the things that we have to understand in terms of the significance, we got to remember that the whole Western Hemisphere at this time, everyone owned slaves. Everyone owned slaves. So the concept of making a very violent proclamation of independence is not simply about ego, say, ha, we beat you. It's to literally put fear and terror in the Western world to let you know that we will defend this to the death, and to basically make them shudder at the notion of continuing this process of Black enslavement. Because one of the things that's also very clear in the early historical historiography of the founders under the Dessalinian project is that they saw Haiti, and I've criticized this though, as a vindicationist project of Blackness. They saw Haiti as that we will be the ones that will defend the Black race. That was particularly in Christophe's under Baron de Vaté. That was a very strong part of the ideology, that we are here to defend the honor of the Black race. Even though I've been critical of vindicationism, I can understand why, in that context of the world that they lived in, why they would indulge in it and feel the need to do so.
Ooh, I feel like we should have had this conversation before. I just wrote an article on Toussaint Louverture's memoir and vindicationism, but we'll talk about it more later.
Not a problem. So let's go to the next question, if you will, that I wanted to ask you about. How do you see the social, and we addressed this, how do you see the social position of the major players in your book in the pre-revolutionary Saint-Domingue period, also shaping their worldview during and after the Haitian Revolution?
Oh my God. I mean, it's a great question. Yes, it did. But it's also an enormous question. I mean, I'll start to take some stabs here and then we can maybe develop it. I mean, on the one hand, I maybe just to overview for people who are unfamiliar, the sort of general way of dividing up, a position during the revolutionary period is the colonists, the free people of color, and the enslaved insurgents. But among the group of free people of color and enslaved insurgents, there's just such diversity as well. This class, free people of color, was itself a class. And certainly the impact of the 18th century on this class in Haiti is significant. There was a real effort to sort of reimpose and sort of reassert a white supremacy and control in the 18th century by instituting all of these laws that, really sort of clawed back privilege from this class. You mentioned that the free people of color, also many of them owned slaves, were plantation owners. But especially after the 7 Years' War, many of them were subjected to laws that required them to no longer use certain titles, restrictions on the type of clothing that they could wear, the professions that they could hold, a real, a sort of an enforcement of this division that became really a source of contention and of strife. But then, over the course of the revolution, there's an attempt both to argue for the rights of that class and then to expand it basically to include all citizens. And there's obviously a sort of a weakening of the argument for, privilege among this class in the radical project of sort of free and French citizens. But there still are many divisions that remain despite the fact that there's this ideology of radical equality. Among the enslaved insurgents, there also are myriad differences and sort of gradations, if you will, certainly within the plantation system, sort of types of labor that one is forced to, and sort of ways you can accumulate status, but also sort of the military, especially in the 1790s, became the space of real possibility and also of ascending in that way. And so to think about sort of how that influences or shapes sort of the post-independence worldview, I mean, on a small, I don't want to say on a small scale, like, yes, it all makes sense that in society, right, there will be sort of hierarchies and conflicts. But on the other hand, when we're thinking about sort of this last moment of the War of Independence from 1802 to 1804 and then after, it sort of doesn't matter. I mean, of course it matters, but there's such a fight for the life of this project and the ability to sort of see it through that, I mean, David Gegges writes about this at length in his work on the War of the South, the Civil War during the Revolutionary period, and then the sort of War of Independence. There is unity. I mean, of course, there's still disunity. There are assassinations of certain insurgents and all of that, but there is this sort of understanding that the project requires some agreement among all of these diverse and distinct groups in order to achieve this project.
Yes, and I would argue that unity comes out of the exegesis of realization that they would all either be put in shackles or exterminated. In other words, when Leclerc comes to Haiti in 1802 with the Napoleonic army, with Boyer, Pétion, and Rigaud fighting for Napoleon to take over the country, basically there was fear. And many of the generals, even the black ones, surrendered to Leclerc. But they were not absolutely sure whether or not the notion of slavery was going to be reinstated. After Toussaint Louverture is taken away and taken to a prison in France, and Leclerc dies of yellow fever, Rochambeau, who was an avowed racist makes it clear that not only does he think about putting them all, whether they are mulatto or black, whether they are Creole or whether they are Bosal, under the shackles, he has the active idea that maybe it'd be better to genocide everyone above the age of maybe 12 and bring back new Africans. And he imports literally dogs from Cuba that are genetically or they are biologically bred to kill black and brown people. And so his plan to genocide the island and the realization that their mulatto status or their black Creole status would not save them is the basic factor that forces them to unite under Dessalines and realize that they've got to get these French people out of here no matter what.
And this on today, I feel like that's a really good point to point out about Rochambeau and about sort of the just extreme violence of these final acts, if you will, these months of the the War of Independence, really. Jean-Pierre Le Glonec, who is a Canadian scholar, wrote a book on the Battle of Vertières, which really goes through the writing of the period, the correspondence of the period, and just these like hallucinations of violence and of, I mean, it's as if sort of the French army and the soldiers and obviously Rochambeau are crazed. It's remarkable, and
this is why I argue that Dessalines is the man of the moment, and Louverture would have never been able to handle this because of his affinity to show, genuflection to the desires of the whites. That
is that your argument?
No, that's my argument. I'm
not a
2-cent Louverture fan. I actually like Julia Gaffield's work a great deal on this issue, but my position is that Dessalines was known to be one of the most brutal generals in terms of dealing with his opponents. One of the greatest stories is that Rochambeau takes 500 Haitian officers or soldiers, I don't know if they're officers, and he shoots them and he kills them. And Dessalines in response gets 500 Haitian soldiers, they might have been officers, and gets 500 scaffolds and hangs them and lets them die and lets their bodies rest in effigy to bring terror into the French army.
French, not Haitian soldiers, French soldiers, yeah.
Yeah, French soldiers, yeah. Mm-hmm. So definitely there was a brutality, and I think and I think that one of the things that was great about having Dessalines the leader at that time is that he gave it as good as they took it.
But so this is really, I mean, this is sort of, I've been thinking about this a lot. You asked a great question that I'm sure we'll get to about sort of the new directions or sort of these new debates in Haitian studies. But Vincent Brown's book, Tacky's Revolt, makes this argument that insurgency is war, and that actually, like, this is a longer history of war. Slave insurgency isn't just, a moment, right, in a plantation setting. It is a transatlantic war that extends sort of African wars to the Caribbean. I think thinking about especially the War of Independence, sort of maybe in that long, or maybe even 1791 on, is really illuminating to trying to think about what is happening here and what this is. It's not just a successful, insurgency. It's a war.
No, absolutely, without a doubt. So I want to theological point is out. They came together. Yes, they came together, but they came together because they were compelled to come together. It's not like they just had this natural kind of affinity. It was like, oh, let's hold hands and come together. No, it was the exigencies of the moment that brought them together. Mm-hmm. But let's talk about more so what happens after independence. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I was interested about your book is that you didn't talk about the land reform issue or the nationalizing of the land and this is, I think, actually gets us out of the racial thing. Mm-hmm. And I think that the greatest motivational aspect of the Dessalinian betrayal of the mulattoes wasn't even a matter of color or politics. It was that Dessalines he literally not wanted to, but he took their ability to inherit land from their white fathers and nationalize all the land with the intention of redistributing it to the peasant class. And which I think the one thing he did wrong was doing something, as Biggie Smalls says, bad boys move in silence. And announcing his plan probably was what got him killed. But you don't really talk that much about it in the book. And I think you don't really have to, because, you do talk about it later on in the book. But Do you think that the economic motivation, because I don't think it was really as much about color, I think it was about the economic motivation of the loss of wealth. Do you think that could have been more of the driving force behind why they really took issue with the Dessalines project?
No, I mean, I think you're right to point that out. And it absolutely, and again, Julia Gaffield's work here is really crucial. And she's also writing a biography of Dessalines.
Yes.
That's going to just illuminate this so much. First biography in English, I believe. It's going to be an event. So I'm excited to be able to sort of defer to her on some of this too. But kind of to recast what I'm doing, I am interested in the ways of sort of writing and crafting and casting the projects, right? Even the justification of the assassination and the revolution of the Southern sort of Republican faction is what I'm sort of mapping. But to your point, absolutely. The South was always opaque, even and that's why the 1804 to 1806 period is so key. The South was really sort of a stronghold even during these first years and during Dessalines' state turned republic. He was able to administrate to a degree, but it remained outside of his reach for all intents and purposes. And so, yes, this decision to take land titles and to take them for the state, nationalize them, and then with the purposes of redistributing them, if not set into motion, certainly amped up this resistance and sort of the plotting to overturn him.
You can say that Dessalines was a socialist before Marx.
You don't need Marx to see, Haiti in that way. I mean, I understand. I'm on the This Is Revolution podcast, so I don't want to,
No, it's all right. I have no problem. I'm sure you're familiar with the book that on Hegelian thought that argues that Hegel's master slave narrative was inspired by the Haitian Revolution. So I've always made the argument: no Hegel master slave argument, no Marxist retort. So I would argue that Marxist thought is actually a product of the Haitian Revolution in some ways. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of
Marlena Doubt has an article in Small Axe that really kind of thinks through some of this too. It just came out. I believe it's called Beyond Toyo.
Yeah. So I mean, I don't know anyone has made that claim publicly besides myself, but I actually believe that because of the way in which the Haitian Revolution influences Hegel and Marx's response to Hegel, that Marxism is a direct byproduct of the Haitian Revolution. So there's going to be a lot of chatter amongst a lot of trots and white lefts and MLs are going to be like, what did you say? But whatever, what can you do?
I mean, it does, even if, what Haiti is doing, 1791, 1802 to 1804 and beyond is central. I mean, I really do think this is the argument that Marlena is making in this piece in Small Axe, but like you don't need to go beyond. It's true that and I make this argument in my book as well about sort of how I'm using some of the theoretical concepts I use to frame what I'm doing. Those make like the theoretical concepts that I mobilize make my work legible within like the academy and within sort of the contemporary discourse, but they're just words I use to identify processes that precede most of what the theoretical concepts are meant to talk about.
Absolutely. No, I'm enjoying this, and this is going great, and I'm glad we got you for the Patreon hour as well. But let us continue. So, next question: why do you believe there has been both an internal and external design to undermine the Dessalines project by certain actors inside of Haiti and many actors outside of Haiti? And anecdotally, as you know, and you talk about in your book, there's a period of time, and this is for our viewers who don't know this, after Dessalines is assassinated, there are like decades where the man's name cannot be mentioned in the country at all.
In writing. I mean, again, I think his continued presence in Vodou, in song, I think there's probably so much more there. I mean, there are some really interesting oral histories and like short stories and ethnographic research from the middle of the 20th century that sort of looks more into that. Jean Fouchard and Colin Diane. But yeah, no, I mean, at least in any kind of public writing, either internally or externally, utter silence. So yeah, I love this question. I mean, it really is, it's actually kind of the heart of my book in a lot of ways. And maybe hence my dodge on like land reform, because that's too concrete. And I want to kind of look at these more textual and sort of evolutionary, or how text evolves. But I call it Dessalines Disavowed in my book, which is kind of riffing on Sibylla Fisher's Modernities Disavowed, which is still a vital book, I think. I think externally, the desire to disavow, we've kind of already touched on it. It's straightforward, if not still completely damning. The modern capitalist slaveholding West was not going to accept the Dessalinian project, full stop. Jefferson famously described Haiti as a brigand rebel state, and then of course embargoed trade and cut them off diplomatically. And what we were talking about actually previously with Vertières, there's so much writing from this, post-France loss, right, that paint Dessalines as a violent monster. And these are, of course, not factual or unbiased accounts by any means. Dessalines.
We're going to get to the 800-pound gorilla in the room, and I love this gorilla because I have no problem with this gorilla. The 800-pound gorilla in the room, as to why Westerners and even some Haitians claim that Dessalines was just the abomination to all the world, is that he's accused of, quote unquote, massacring all the whites on the island out of some kind of blood vengeance. Which, number one, let's correct it. Number one, he did not massacre all the whites. The Polish who fought with him stayed and have a whole city in Haiti named for them to this day, Fort de Blanc, which is the fort of the whites. And their descendants are still there. Shout out to our boy Cuba. I call him who's on our show, Cuba Wazinski. Second of all, he only killed French, but usually males. As a matter of fact, if you read his 1805 Constitution, he actually allows the remaining white women to own land, as a matter of fact, in the country, as a matter of fact. And largely, those acts were done, as Julia Garfield so eloquently illustrates, is because the French soldiers, after they lost, went to the Dominican Republic and were planning not only to come back to the country, but to exterminate and genocide the country. And they were members of the French society in Haiti who were cheering that plan on. So I would argue that not only was a preemptive strike that was made necessary, I will be even more direct. Even if that was not the case, what sense does it make to have a Black republic where you have a class of people who were attached to your former colony who would always have the class and economic position as they grew in population to maintain a hierarchy in terms of land and property of the country if you don't exterminate them?
I mean, you're citing all the things I would cite. I mean, I wouldn't use the word exterminate. I mean, I understand what you're saying, and I don't, I think both the way that this narrative of this Dessalines' decision to kill the remaining French colonists on the island is what the world used to disavow him. It's also what, was one of the major factors that required the Southern Republican faction to have to recast and retell sort of the story of independence to disavow this, right, for their own purposes. But yes, you're absolutely
right. And
I
really mentioned that basically they saw it as patricide for some of them because they were attached to their white daddies as well. So, I mean, it's not like they didn't have an emotional, horror to the fact that he was doing this also. Because don't forget, a lot of them, that class leaves after that act to go to New Orleans, to go to Louisiana, and they become the Creoles in Louisiana, in New Orleans.
I'm there, but the sort of a diaspora of Saint-Dominguans, if you will, extends to 1791, right? There are people leaving in droves, sort of in yeah, absolutely. No, but it precipitated by design too, right? It's a form of saber rattling as well, if albeit physical and violent. But I think this is also really important too. I mean, there is this decision, right? But this is the resolute decision. It is war, right? I cited Vin Brown's book. Dessalines is in the sense at war, and I know this is an argument that Julia makes as well, Julia Garfield. But I think what's really important is that some of this really is still present today. In France's relationship to Haiti and to Louverture versus Dessalines. I mean, like, Louverture can be so easily co-opted into the French Universalist project. Right? The National Mausoleum has a spot waiting for his remains that will never come. But it is almost impossible to think about how Dessalines could be celebrated in France today because, of course, of his decision, but because of his insistence on race, because he displaced France and saw this defeat and refused French republicanism.
I don't know if you remember, recently there was an issue where the Haitian community in Brooklyn was going to name a street after Dessalines. And let me tell you how this emanates today. Tucker Carlson had a whole show talking about how this is horrible. This man is not well known. He was terrible. He killed all the white people. This is on Fox News. This is less than 5 years ago.
Yep. Oh, well, like, you can go on Twitter and see, like, the G word. If you were to put that up on Twitter and then talk about Dessalines, you'd be buried. Like, it just brings out all the trolls.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I'm looking forward to Julia Gaffield's work, but she's gonna really correct the record. But I mean,
there's a great article, short piece in Washington Post. Actually, two.
I saw that.
Yeah, piece. And it's great. It's one of those ones that is pushing sort of the narrative.
Yes.
In new ways.
But your book, what I like about your book is that you don't get bogged down in that, but you're kind of like, yeah, he did it, so what? It's kind of like, the man still was the father of the country, and his ideas were pretty great and pretty good, and big deal. And I think that for many, many people who are seeing that, and this is what I love about the contemporary scholarship coming out of parts, contrary to some, like, many Haitians are very skeptical of any white people who write about Haitian history. There are some white people who've been writing about Haitian history in America who I think they should be skeptical of. I'm not going to mention their names. You mentioned one of them already, but I'm not going to do that. But the point I'm going to say is that some of the post-Haiti earthquake Haitian Revolution scholars, particularly by Julia Gaffield, folks like yourself, even some of the work that's been done by Laurent Dubois, I think is very, very good and very, very important. Some of the older white scholars who've been writing about Haiti, I think this guy Girard, his work is horrible. I'm only mentioning him because his book is so ridiculous. No one should take it seriously, but allegedly. But some of the older ones, I find that their whole project, particularly one who you've named already, is to disavow the importance of the Haitian Revolution in terms of how they write. As a matter of fact, you actually cite him in your book. I'm not going to mention his name, but he says that Haiti invading the Dominican Republic is the same as Europe entering and attacking the African continent. He makes a metaphor that somehow Haiti, which only invaded the Dominican Republic to protect itself from being attacked by Europeans, is similar to a major colonial power coming in and attacking Africa. I mean,
well, and even the term invasion itself carries some extremely problematic connotations with Dominican anti-Blackness, and so that itself is really problematic. Yeah.
But we're coming to the end of our first hour, but Jason wants to read some of the super chats.
We had some super chat questions because people were very excited about this conversation as well.
I want to ask you one question, though. Shirley asked a very important question. Did the Haitian Revolution have anything to do with the British decide to end of the transatlantic slave trade? And if you read the book that came out in 2016 about abolitionism, I forgot the title right now, The Slave Cause, I forgot the name. It was a very good book by an Indian woman. She talks about how Clarkson, Wilberforce, and the British abolitionists were definitely inspired by the Haitian Revolution to initiate the end of the British transatlantic slave trade.
So you're going to let me ask these damn questions now?
Yes, go ahead.
No more Haiti for you. No more Haiti for you. This is what happens, people, when he gets Haiti Day. I wasn't even going to come on the show today because I knew he was going to do this.
We're glad you're here, Jason.
Stop. It's Haiti Day. Is Haiti still paying for independence?
Oof. This is a really good question, and one that I hoped I could get to. I mean, Pascal had asked me a question about, is Dessalines' assassination sort of this like crucial turning point moment? And I actually don't think so. Only in that, like, the West wasn't going to let that happen one way or another. Like, within the context of Haiti, yes, but I think the most significant, and it's a counterfactual in a way, right? But But I think the most important, actually, if we were to do a counterfactual, like what if Jean-Pierre Boyer had not signed that indemnity agreement in 1825? That to me is the one where we can measure tangible, actual, consequences.
Say it again for the people in the back.
Go ahead. Please go ahead.
No, he wants to say it again for the people in the back.
So I think the most interesting and useful counterfactual that we could entertain here, and the thing that I think is the most significant, the event that has the most significant consequences on post-revolutionary Haiti and Haiti today, is the 1825 indemnity agreement that Haitian Republican President Jean-Pierre Boyer signed with the King of France, Charles X, in which Haiti agreed to pay the French government 150 million francs in exchange for France's official recognition of Haitian independence. This money was to indemnify, that is, to pay back those in the colonial lobby, those who had claims to land in Saint-Domingue, who argued that Haitian independence amounted to a loss of that income and property. Marlene Adout has a great article on this in The Conversation online, When France Extorted Haiti. It's fantastic. But what's so important, there's also an amazing website that you can go to. A French research institute has put up. Basically, they've digitized all of the indemnity payments or claims, both for 1825 and for 1848 and 49, because, France didn't just do it once. They did it when they abolished slavery in Guadeloupe and Martinique in 1848.
No, they used that model with every African country that became independent.
But the British did too. Yeah, no, absolutely. No, there's something trending on Twitter today about that. Absolutely. But so you can look that up and you can see. But what is so crucial is that Haiti paid. They paid. They had to take out loans immediately from France. They paid the initial sum. I believe they finished paying off in 1883. Louis-Joseph Janvier has these amazing texts. I'm actually working with
Thank you for bringing him up. One of the reasons I love your book, Louis Janvier, one of the most underappreciated intellectuals in Haitian history.
Well, so you'll love this. We are translating. Nadev Minar is translating, and Brandon Bird and I are writing this we submitted to peer review, but it's a critical introduction to Haïti aux Haïtiens, Haiti for the Haitians. And it's so shaped by this moment of neo-imperialism and this, basically the economics of this indemnity and also U.S. interests in Haiti. But the crucial point I want to say is Haiti's still paying. I mean, when the U.S. invaded Haiti, that was part of your introduction, they also ended up taking over the remaining debt, basically, and then reissuing bonds. And basically, Haiti ended up finishing off its indemnity payment to France and that debt via the U.S. and the U.S. occupation, I believe in 1947.
Yes, that was 30 years. Yeah, I tell people all the time, Haiti didn't pay its debt until 1947, which was literally 5 years after my father's birth.
No, yeah, I mean, but that is, again, is that paying for independence? Well, yeah, an indemnity to the former colonial, planters and plantation owners is.
And Christophe he chose not to do that.
Absolutely. I mean,
Pétion was thinking about that. Boyer did it, and I bet Jason can guess what complexion and class they came from. The guys who decided.
Was it one of those mulattoes?
That's correct. Who, by the way, Boyer was one of the generals who came back to fight against Toussaint Louverture, fighting for Napoleon as well. That general, that guy. And there are actually some Haitians who believe he was a great president. That's how bad Haitians have an understanding of their history.
We have one more super chat question, but we only have 3 minutes, and I don't think we're going to get to it because you guys are just literally going off.
Can I say there's a super chat question about the Black Jacobins, and you, Pascal, have criticisms?
Yes, I have a lot of criticisms.
Thank you. Okay, well, I was just going to, one of the things I wanted to say, we were talking about these competing narratives about Haitian historical writing in the West, but the interesting one that's happening right now that scholars are really rethinking, this has been sort of over the past 30 years, is that the Enlightenment inspired the slave insurgency. And it's just sort of and that the Enlightenment was responsible for kind of the Haitian Revolution. And I think a little bit of that comes from C.L.R. James.
Yeah, C.L.R. James. I never suggest C.L.R. James's book to anyone about the Haitian Revolution. And I'm not going to get into left sectarianism as to explain why, but I never suggest that book. He totally miscast.
He's a trot? Are you calling him a trot?
I don't want to get into that.
No, but I mean, you, Pascal, feel like I have to differentiate just from you in terms of how I feel about it. In terms of factual information about the Haitian Revolution, there are so many other good books to read, but it's a super crucial book for understanding, the 1930s and 40s, and actually through the 60s. And that in and of itself is really important, but that's understanding James and that context. It's not understanding Haiti.
Do you have a critique on Trotskyists, Chelsea?
Oh, please. I wouldn't dare. In this space, this is what I do.
Behind a paywall, are you and Pascal going to have your Trotskyist critiques?
No, I'm not going to. I got no problem. I'm not going to be talking about the Trots, man. That's not my point.
This is funny. I'm gonna get them to say something before we go on air for the after hours, because I do want to hear Chelsea's Trotskyist critique, because you have no idea how much I hear Pascal call people Trots.
Bro, non-sectarian leftism is our theme on this show.
Look, Mr.
I know where my bread's better.
Chelsea, I just want you to know before we go off air, I want to say this on the free half. Tuesday, Mr. I love Chelsea's book so much took off way early on our bonus after hours segment to finish your book. He literally said, I have 2 more chapters to go and I want to finish this book. I love this book. This is a quote from Pascal, literally on air. And then I went off on a bit of a rant that Pascal would not have approved of.
So you're saying it's my fault? No, just kidding.
I am saying it's all of your fault. That's what I'm saying. But I'm excited for the after hours, because I definitely want to ask you guys some questions about the occupation starting in 1915.
By the way, I love some of your theorization about the occupation and its connection to Duvalier. We're going to talk about that as well. Very good stuff. Jason, you like that. She has a very good theory as to why Duvalier became what he was.
Oh, yeah. I also work on Caribbean fascism. So there's...
You don't want to say that. You don't want to say that on our show. Not about the doc. Not about the doc. You don't want to say that about the doc on our show.
I think it's very important to talk about Baby Doc or Papa Doc, all the docs in a modern context, because
there's a revival of there's the neo-Duvalierism in Haiti.
I feel it in certain online spaces, definitely, but I definitely think people are a little more susceptible to that level of rhetoric, and we definitely talk about it on this show with patriotic socialism and Nazballs and all that other stuff that people are really, really susceptible to, because the idea to say words like socialism in 2021 and have it not be such a negative word as it was in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, literally up until
the F word?
No. You don't have a problem talking about fascism, but talking about fascism and relating it to Francois Duvalier, there's going to be a lot of Haitians who'll be like, did she say Papa Doc is a fascist?
Listen, that's a much more complicated thing. I'm talking about sort of that Maurassian 1920s.
Right. No, there are a lot of Haitians who would call Papa Doc an Afro-fascist. It's not like I haven't heard it before.
But, would you call him? Well, you know what? We're saying stuff. We've gone over an hour. We're saying stuff that we should be saying behind the paywall. So
we're going to send you a link so you can sign on to the after hours, Chelsea. Is that okay? We'll send it to you via email.
If you are not a patron, it is very easy to become one. It is simple. It is patreon.com/Bitter Lake Presents. And there's already a link up. So as soon as you sign on to Patreon, you'll see the link initially to this conversation, which will start in about 15 minutes. Chelsea promised us she's going to eat on air.
Is that enough time?
15 minutes? That's great. Yeah.
So thank you, guys.
The book is Haiti's Paper War, Post-Independence Writing, Civil War, and the Making of the Republic, 1804 to 1954, by Dr. Chelsea Stieber.
And
so good, I got it twice on Kindle and the physical copy.
He did. He totally bought it twice. Like, that's how sprung off the book he is. Anywhere you're watching this show, there are links in the description that have a link directly to get Chelsea's book. I will say this, and unfortunately I didn't say this earlier on, it is a very easy read. Even though Chelsea is an academic, she does not get hamstrung like many academics do in making the book unreadable for us non-PhDs. So thank you for doing that, Chelsea. It was very easy to fall right into the book.
Awesome.
So thank you guys very much, and we are out.